Prof. Moglen.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be among friends. I've been away from Delhi too long. I'm glad I got here before the chaos really begins. I want to try to put not the software patent issue in perspective. My colleague Rishi Chaudhary will be talking about what we really mean to do here in putting our bit forward about software patents. I want to start by talking about the other theme of our seminar today, that is the commons and what it means and why. Good morning, my dear man. I'm starting my speech, but I should actually refer to you and let you start yours. The commons as an idea is an old one in both the civilization here and the civilization of the West. In fact, it's really the oldest idea because agriculture begins before power begins. And in the beginning of both civilizations based on hunting and gathering and civilizations based on agriculture without irrigation, the commons is the fundamental method of production. The land worked by all the people who need to eat from it. But the definition of the commons in the world of pre-industrial economic life, the definition of the commons is a passive definition. Commons are resources of nature manageable through collaboration. Fisheries, surface water resources, and agricultural production on undivided or unowned land. That commons, the passive commons, the fertile commons of nature's gifts to human beings to be shared equally by all, is the beginning of the working class resistance to hierarchy in the West. The great peasant rising that occurred in England in 1381 begins from a preacher, John Ball, who said, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? That is to say, that commons is really the producer of equality, and ownership is the producer of inequality. But what is being thought about, as I say, is undivided resources of nature, free to everyone to use equally. A passive definition subject to the use of what we would think of as the coercive violence of owners, enclosure, the restoration of property rights said to have existed in nature from the beginning, laid on top of previously shared resources, whether they are fisheries or agricultural land or timber or any of the other products previously available for sharing. Over the last 400 years, economic progress in the West and in those parts of the non-Western world imperialized by Western societies, economic progress mostly meant the reduction of commons and the increase of ownership, the enclosure or the creation of exclusive rights in particular parties, said to be necessary in order to permit the investment of capital and the increasing of the scale of production. And beginning in the early 17th century through the end of the 20th century, economic progress came to be identified directly in the societies of ownership with the idea of the reduction of commons to its minimum possible extent. By the end of the 20th century, it was possible for an economist and lawyer like Judge Posner in the United States to say that efficiency requires that everything be subjected to exclusive ownership, because only exclusive ownership is capable of maximizing welfare. That's the end point of a process of the treating of the passive commons as the traditional economy displaced by active efforts. And the active efforts in the economy, the agents of active change, are owners who displace traditional commons-based production and replace it with production based on ownership. The irony here is that just as that theory of the superiority of ownership to commons in production was reaching its completion at the end of the 20th century, just as it was becoming the doctrine of political economy orthodoxy in the West, that only ownership can maximize the value of production, it was ceasing to be true at all. What happened at the end of the 20th century was a series of steps that proved that production in commons, that is, production by sharing without ownership, could actually be superior in quality and efficiency of production to ownership production. Software is the beginning of that process. But that's not a consequence of something special to software. It's a consequence of something special to digital goods. And what happened at the end of the 20th century is that we digitized all of human culture. Not merely software, but music, art, useful information, technical guidance, the control of machines, the conduct of warfare, the choreographic of dance, the substance of religion. All of the pieces of human culture, good and bad, became bitstreams at the end of the 20th century. And they began to participate in a political economy which has properties different from the properties of the political economy of the prior half millennium. In the world of industrialization, the identification between economic development and active reduction of commons ownership makes some technical sense. The process of mining or smelting or making steel and bending it into automobile parts or other objects does in fact reward significantly hierarchical production. The economies of scale are vast. The abilities to collaborate without legal mechanisms of control are few. And capital had the best possible case for the efficiency of ownership under the conditions of industrial production. Digital production is quite different. There are few economies of scale. They exist, they are available in some places. But the largest entities of culture and technology making were quick to discover at the very end of the 20th century and are now fully absorbing in the 21st that digital culture and digital economic life do not reward economies of scale, they reward economies of collaboration. In my society, as well as in yours, you can't sell a product anymore without a URL. You wouldn't bother advertising a lipstick or a deodorant or a table good or a food product on the side of a bus or in a train without a website. Because there's no way to sell a product effectively anymore without a community around it. If the product is a bitstream, you can't make it without a community around it. Production and distribution in commons, that is to say, taking advantage of activity which is not owned and not reducible to an exclusive right, is becoming for everybody a crucial part of the new, innovative structures of the digital economy. This commons, unlike the agricultural or fisheries or surface water resources commons of the past, are not passive resources. They don't model well as things affected by the active behavior of human beings, themselves simply responsive to traditional natural rhythms. On the contrary, the productive and distribution commons of the 21st century are active. Commons is an agent. Rather than being a woodlot or a pond full of fish, commons is a society producing something with purpose, with goals, with strategy, and capable of resistance. So what I want to begin by pointing out as a prelude to the conversation of smarter and more diligent people later in this day, what I want to begin by pointing out is that at the present moment we are not only watching a historical reversal as commons production begins to compete successfully against ownership across a broad range of human endeavor, we're also watching that happen with commons playing a new role as an active agent in the alteration of 21st century political economy. So let me spell out just a little bit further what I mean by the activity of commons as an agent. In the beginning, There was a small conspiracy to distort the global IT industry. A couple of us wanted to destroy proprietary software and to turn the global IT industry into an industry based on sharing of resources. At the beginning of the 1980s, there were half a dozen such people in the world. There are now several 100,000, and they have transformed the global IT industry. Even Microsoft, and I do mean even Microsoft because it is the last and most reluctant participant in the process, now fully realizes that commons production is crucial to 21st century information technology. Vertically integrated, ownership-based, hierarchically organized production of software is dying. It's not dead, but it's dying. And even those places in which it has still some remaining vitality can only assure that vitality by interacting with and interoperating with software produced in commons. This is not merely limited to software. In 1999, I wrote a little piece called Anarchism Triumphant, Free Software and the Death of Copyright, in which I pointed out what was happening in the software. And at the conclusion of that piece, I said, now the same thing is going to happen to music, and then it's going to happen to journalism, and we shall see that anarchist production, that is production without ownership, will transform the music industry and the system of journalism in the next 10 years. And my colleagues who are tired of me even before I start speaking look at me like, you know, which planet do you live on again, and where do you spend the rest of your time? And 10 years later, of course, the music industry around the world was being killed off by commons distribution, and musicians were beginning to discover that there were better alternatives than dealing with exclusive licensors of their music, and journalism was sustaining a global meltdown of the process of owned ideas. You can't have a newspaper anymore without commentary, right? You can't have an interaction in the press without what the press regards as user-generated content. That is to say, journalism itself is failing to maintain hierarchy. Editors don't control, owners of editors don't control, reporters don't control, press lords and press magnates, no matter how many news corps they own, do not control. Last year in the United States, a global multimedia monolith decided it wanted to destroy a small free software program which competes with a small proprietary program owned by a tiny affiliate of the global megalith. The sort of thing which they think is sort of easy, you know, you dispatch a regiment out of many divisions and you crush the thing and come home and eat lunch. And as is the responsibility of the Software Freedom Law Center to get in between armies of destruction and free software projects, we were in between. And my job was to prevent the large multimedia conglomerate of worldwide scale and scope from destroying a tiny free software project coming from one American university, whose lawyers, of course, didn't want to fight the megalopolis, let alone on behalf of some free software project they didn't understand anyway, which was only needed by about 300,000 scholars around the world. There are 3 million downloads, but let's assume that only 10% of people download and use it.